December 1943. The war in the Pacific was defined by a single, relentless enemy: distance. The American push toward Japan was not a battle of continuous front lines, but a slow, agonizing campaign of island hopping, requiring the seizure of isolated hostile coral specks separated by thousands of miles of open ocean. The ultimate goal was air superiority. To bomb the Japanese home islands, the U.S. Army Air Forces needed massive runways capable of handling the heavy B-29 superfortresses. To support the advancing fleet and Marines, they needed forward operating bases for P-51 Mustangs and carrier aircraft. But the Central Pacific offered no natural ground for such construction. The islands were either volcanic rock or, more commonly, low-lying coral atolls, sand, reef, and dense jungle, prone to flooding and utterly incapable of supporting heavy, permanent structures. The Imperial Japanese Army's engineering doctrine, much like that of their German allies, was founded on the philosophy of monumental permanence and fortification. They built their defenses and their limited airfields with dense, slow-curing concrete, creating capital, enduring structures meant to last forever. This approach was meticulous, demanding specialized cement, complex mixing plants, and massive logistical chains dedicated solely to shipping thousands of tons of aggregate across vast distances. The American logistics machine, already stretched thin by the sheer magnitude of the theater, choked on this requirement. Shipping millions of barrels of cement, sand, and heavy rollers from the U.S. West Coast to islands like Tinian or Kwajalein was a logistical nightmare that threatened to slow the entire offensive to a crawl. The entire campaign risked collapsing under the weight of its own infrastructure needs. Japanese command watched with a mixture of contempt and disbelief. They saw American planners struggling to replicate European construction methods on tropical reefs. Their strategy relied on the certainty that the Americans, forced to rely on shipping traditional materials, could not possibly construct the necessary bases fast enough to keep pace with the island seizures. Japanese field engineers openly mocked the initial, failed attempts by U.S. Army engineers to clear away the dense jungle and lay down crushed stone flown in from Hawaii. The solution, when it arrived, was a classic paradox of American engineering. A solution found not in superior technology or complicated chemistry, but in the simple acceptance of the environment itself. It came from the ingenuity of the Navy Construction Battalions, Seabees, a unit of civilian contractors turned uniformed construction workers who realized that the islands themselves were the answer. They were about to turn the very coral the Japanese thought was weak, brittle, and disposable into the backbone of America's unstoppable advance. The Japanese laughed at the idea of an island built from its own cardboard skeleton. That laughter would cease the moment the first wave of American fighters launched from a runway that, by all engineering logic, should have collapsed after the first landing. The battle would be won not with concrete, but with pulverized reef. The discovery that revolutionized the Pacific theater was made not in a laboratory, but in the field by the hard-hatted men of the Seabees. Faced with the impossible task of importing traditional aggregate, sand, gravel, and stone, over thousands of miles of hostile water, they began experimenting with the only material available in infinite supply: coral. The Japanese engineers dismissed coral as unreliable, citing its brittle nature and high porosity. They saw it as merely sand and broken rock. But the Seabees uncovered the secret of the reef. Crushed coral, composed primarily of calcium carbonate, possessed a unique, almost magical property. When pulverized, mixed with water, often seawater readily available, and subjected to heavy compaction, a process the Seabees called chewing it up and spitting it out, the material acted as a self-cementing aggregate. Under the pressure of heavy rollers, the sharp edges of the coral fragments would abrade and break down into fine, silt-sized particles. This fine material, rich in calcium, acted as a natural binder. It chemically reacted to form a dense, interlocked, and surprisingly durable foundation layer that became almost monolithic upon drying. It wasn't the chemical strength of Portland cement, but it was good enough, and it was instant. The material's strength was in its availability and speed. Traditional construction required a massive, continuous supply chain of cement, which often required a dedicated Liberty ship just for the raw materials. The coral method eliminated this entire logistical requirement. A bulldozer or a heavy tractor equipped with a drag scoop could simply claw the raw material directly from the lagoon bed or the exposed reef, crush it on the spot, and lay it down for compaction. The contrast with the meticulous Japanese methods was stark. The Japanese approach demanded weeks of curing time for concrete. The American coral method required only hours of compaction time before a jeep could drive over it. And for the critical task of runway construction, speed was the difference between life and death. A CB battalion could convert a captured patch of jungle and reef into a functional 5,000-foot airstrip in 3 to 5 days. A Japanese engineering battalion, adhering to capital standards, would require 3 to 5 weeks for the same task. The American Seabees did not win the engineering argument on durability. They won it on time, using the very rock the enemy stood on. The adoption of crushed coral as the primary aggregate was a victory of zero material cost over maximum material quality. This philosophical shift immediately freed up an enormous volume of Allied shipping that would have otherwise been dedicated to the engineering effort. The Japanese war machine, facing its own crippling logistical problems, could not comprehend this shift. They maintained their belief that a military installation must be built to withstand decades, requiring the continuous importation of specialized cement, rebar, and gravel. Their construction philosophy imposed a massive friction tax on their supply lines, slowing down everything else. The American Seabees, on the other hand, had effectively eliminated the need to import millions of tons of raw construction material. A single B-29 superfortress runway required approximately 200,000 cubic yards of fill. Hauling that much aggregate from the West Coast was logistically impossible. By using local coral, the U.S. Navy transformed this impossible logistical requirement into a simple earth-moving exercise. The materials now shipped across the Pacific were no longer sand and cement, but the machinery of speed: bulldozers, rock crushers, massive rollers, and fuel to power them. The material cost was paid for by the sweat of the Seabees and the horsepower of the Caterpillar tractors. This strategic liberation allowed the U.S. Navy to dedicate its valuable Liberty ships almost exclusively to the delivery of fuel, ammunition, food, and, critically, replacement aircraft. The speed of the island-hopping campaign, the defining feature of the Pacific War, was directly enabled by the coral runway. Every ton of shipping space that was not occupied by concrete was occupied by high-octane fuel for the advancing fleet. Furthermore, the coral runways offered a crucial advantage in resilience. The Seabees found that simple, expedient maintenance was easy. If a Japanese bomber managed to score a hit on the coral runway, the damage could be quickly patched by simply dumping more pulverized coral into the crater and rolling it flat. This took hours. A similar repair on a Japanese concrete runway required days of setting time, leaving the airfield vulnerable and unusable. The coral runway was not a monument to permanence. It was a testament to instantaneous repairability. The Americans were not just building airfields faster. They were building airfields that the Japanese could not keep out of action. The strategic implications of the crushed coral runway were so profound that they fundamentally broke the Japanese military planning cycle. The Japanese High Command operated under a rigid, predictable doctrine. After an island was lost, the American forces would require a fixed, long period, typically 3 to 4 weeks, to establish a functional airbase before launching sustained air operations against the next target. This established timeline gave the Japanese command the necessary window to move reinforcements, position anti-aircraft defenses, and prepare their interceptor aircraft on the next island in the chain. Their defense strategy was built entirely upon this American logistical lag. The Seabees and their Coral method obliterated this assumption. The ability to churn out a viable, heavy-duty runway in 5 days instead of 5 weeks meant that the air cover for the invasion was never more than a few days behind the ground forces. The Japanese defense was always caught flat-footed. They were constantly fighting an enemy that was not only present in overwhelming numbers on the ground, but was also immediately supported by fighter escorts and tactical bombers launching from an airfield that, according to their rigid doctrine, should not yet exist. One of the most compelling examples of this strategic shock occurred during the seizure of Tinian in 1944. The island was crucial because it offered flat terrain ideal for the long runways required by the B-29 superfortresses. The Japanese defense had been meticulously planned, assuming they would have several weeks of grace period before American air power could transition from carrier-based aircraft to land-based fighters. That grace period never materialized. The Seabees landed their crushing and rolling equipment almost immediately behind the Marines. While the Japanese generals were still calculating the expected arrival date of the first shipment of American cement, the Seabees were already compacting the Coral. The sheer, overwhelming pace of construction led to stunned reports from surviving Japanese field officers. They simply could not reconcile the rate of fire they were under with the fact that, just days earlier, the area was hostile jungle. The Coral runway was a psychological weapon because it implied that the American logistic chain was infinite and instantaneous. Every fighter plane that took off from the newly compacted Coral Strip was a physical symbol that the Japanese strategy of defending island by island had failed before the first shot was fired. They were fighting against an industrial process that could manufacture usable geography faster than they could manufacture defenses. This strategic liberation had a ripple effect across the entire Pacific offensive. The U.S. command could now bypass islands that were heavily fortified, leaving the Japanese forces there to wither on the vine, because they no longer needed every single patch of land for fuel and concrete storage. They only needed enough coral to build the next airbase. This ability to skip over fixed Japanese defenses and launch air missions from the quickly built Coral Islands was the defining factor in accelerating the war. The generals, who had calculated their defense based on the slow, heavy burden of concrete, were defeated by the light, fast expediency of local indigenous coral rock. They had focused on the fortress. The Americans had focused on the flow. The P-51s taking off from that cardboard island were not just fighting the Japanese army, they were fighting the broken philosophy of permanence. The Japanese engineers' initial laughter at the cardboard island was rooted in a profound but strategically fatal commitment to material superiority. The Japanese doctrine dictated that a runway must be a capital asset, built to endure typhoons, heavy bomber weights, and decades of service. This mindset was a direct inheritance of the masterpiece philosophy, a belief that only the most precise, labor-intensive, and resource-heavy construction was worthy of the Imperial Army. When they saw American Seabees simply scraping material from the reef and crushing it, they saw a laughable shortcut that would inevitably fail. Their reliance on slow-curing concrete imposed a massive and crippling friction tax on their entire military machine. Every ton of cement, every sack of specialized aggregate had to be transported thousands of miles by vulnerable, slow cargo ships, constantly hunted by American submarines. The moment the Japanese supply line faltered, all construction stopped. Their construction timetable was utterly dependent on the stability of their increasingly fragile maritime logistics. The American Coral Runway system reversed this equation entirely. The Seabees recognized that the single most expensive and time-consuming input, the raw aggregate, was already present at the construction site. This strategic realization did more than save shipping space. It fundamentally broke the Japanese military-industrial logic. The Americans were no longer limited by the throughput of their supply chain, but only by the throughput of their crushing machines. This led to a stunning numerical contrast that defined the air war. A Japanese engineering battalion required weeks to complete a MATH-BF 5000 Bafor foot runway. An American Seabee battalion, utilizing local coral and heavy equipment shipped just once, could complete the same runway in 5 days. The American time-saving factor was MATH-BF 500 8% tollers or more. This speed translated directly into tactical dominance. For the Japanese, every captured island meant a forced cessation of air superiority for a minimum of 3 weeks. For the Americans, it meant a guaranteed return of land-based air superiority within a single week. The Japanese defense was designed to rely on that 3-week buffer zone, a period of logistical vulnerability where their land-based aircraft could strike American shipping unopposed. By collapsing that buffer zone, the Coral Runway system turned the Japanese defense into a sequence of continuous, unwinnable fights. The humiliation was not just that the American runways functioned, it was that the Seabees were using Japanese resources to defeat the Japanese army. The Americans were consuming the very landscape the Japanese were trying to hold. The material they deemed weak and brittle was being turned into the launching platform for the B-29s that would ultimately incinerate the home islands. The Coral Runway was the perfect symbol of logistical nihilism, a demonstration that American industrial might could and would turn the very earth against its enemy. The fortress mentality of the Japanese had been defeated by the fluid, pragmatic philosophy of the construction battalion. The greatest monument to the victory of the Coral Runway was the island of Tinian. Captured by the Marines in the summer of 1944, Tinian was a flat, ideal piece of geography that the Japanese had fortified but had not fully developed as an airbase, relying on their belief that the logistical cost would delay American use indefinitely. The Japanese failure to comprehend the American capacity for industrial speed was laid bare on Tinian. The island was immediately earmarked to become the largest airbase in the world, the launch pad for the massive B-29 superfortress raids against the Japanese home islands. Using traditional concrete methods, the construction of the 4 massive parallel 8,500-foot runways required for the B-29s would have consumed at least 8 to 10 months of continuous labor, demanding a fleet of cement ships. But the Seabees, fully utilizing the coral technique, began their work immediately. The raw math of the Seabees' performance was staggering. They moved millions of cubic yards of coral aggregate, crushed it, and compacted it with industrial efficiency. The runways were completed not in 10 months, but in just 5 months. This reduction in time by almost half was a strategic victory that saved thousands of lives and cut months off the war. The speed of Tinian's development was a direct result of the elimination of the complex concrete supply chain. The only things that needed to be shipped were the powerful construction machines, the crushers, the rollers, and the fuel to run them, the very tools of speed. The psychological impact on the Japanese command was immense. The American bombing campaign, which was devastating their industries and their will to fight, was sustained by these airfields that were literally manufactured out of the landscape. Every B-29 that roared off the compacted Coral Runway was a reminder that the Japanese strategy of defending islands based on slow, traditional Western logistics had failed utterly. The American B-29s were flying thousands of miles from a massive base that, by all rights of traditional engineering and logistics, should still have been a few scattered coconut palms and a pile of unmixed cement. The Coral Runway system proved that the U.S. capacity for expedient, mass-produced infrastructure was an offensive weapon as potent as any aircraft carrier or marine division. It guaranteed that the pace of the island-hopping campaign would never be dictated by the enemy's ability to destroy ports or blow up bridges. The Americans carried their infrastructure with them, not in the form of raw materials, but in the form of ideas and powerful machinery. The legacy of the crushed Coral Runway is a profound lesson in the strategic difference between two opposing military-industrial philosophies: the fortress mentality versus the fluid system. The Japanese approach, inherited from a commitment to the masterpiece, was to build static, enduring bases designed to be strongholds, fortresses that demanded immense, complex resources for their creation. This commitment made them rigid, predictable, and ultimately vulnerable to a war of movement and attrition. Their engineering sought perfection and permanence. The American approach, pioneered by the Seabees, sought only expediency and flow. The Coral Runway was not intended to be a monument. It was a tool, designed to be built fast, used hard, and maintained simply. The material was disposable and locally sourced. This fluidity meant that when one coral base was damaged, another could be built almost instantly on the next atoll, maintaining the relentless pressure of the campaign. The American system engineered for speed of replacement and continuity of operation. The final verdict on Tinian served as the ultimate proof. It was from the quickly laid coral runways of North Field, Tinian, that the B-29 superfortress Enola Gay took off to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The most decisive moment in human history was launched not from a runway of slow-curing imported concrete, but from a temporary, self-cementing aggregate scraped directly from a conquered coral reef. The speed of construction was the final, unanswerable strategic weapon. The Coral Runway system cut the logistical lead time of the entire Pacific campaign by months, placing the final targets of the war within striking distance far sooner than any Japanese planner could have anticipated. This saved countless lives, shortened the conflict, and confirmed the new reality of modern warfare. The Japanese generals had laughed at the idea of the cardboard island, but the coral base was, in fact, the material symbol of the inevitable defeat. It proved that in a war of global logistics and speed, local, available simplicity is vastly superior to imported, complex perfection. The fortress was defeated by the flow.